So Mike Silver in the San Francisco Chronicle talked to Jimmy Garoppolo, and what became clear in the story, to me at least, or what I think is true, is, you know what, it wasn't the greatest of exits for Jimmy Garoppolo. He and Kyle Shanahan clearly didn't see eye to eye at the end, and a couple things that came out in the story was, first, at the end of this past season, when right after the 49ers had lost to the Eagles, Shanahan was asked about Jimmy Garoppolo and whether he had any future here, and that's when Kyle Shanahan said, no, there's no scenario for that. Apparently that not only took Garoppolo a little bit by surprise, but you could tell he thought it was a little bit uncalled for, and Shanahan can be diplomatic when he wants, or try to be. But anyway, then the big line of Garoppolo was when he said, don't believe everything you hear about what happened with me in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you make of that story? Because I did think it was interesting. There's a lot. I have a ton more questions now after reading it, but there were some things that were answered.
Yeah, and I think it confirms a lot of the feelings that people had around Jimmy Garoppolo and his exit. But I guess the question is whether you place more of that, I don't know, kind of unceremonious ending on Jimmy Garoppolo or Kyle Shanahan. And I think most people kind of felt like they were at the end of their marriage. That was going to be the final season for Jimmy G, if not the year before, when he threw up the deuces and said see ya in the postseason press conference after 2021. But then I thought at that point, even though there was an inflection point, there was still a sense of respect and understanding between the two sides, Jimmy Garoppolo and the 49ers, but mainly Kyle Shanahan. But that summer, Jimmy Garoppolo chose to not get his shoulder surgery at a time that I think Kyle Shanahan would have liked him to do it. And, you know, that's Jimmy G's prerogative. And then following that, we hear the reports about how Jimmy doesn't answer text messages or phone calls. He's not really available in the offseason for anyone who's trying to get a hold of him. And oh, by the way, that's been the way it has always been with Jimmy Garoppolo.
Right.
That, to me, is something that kind of trickled out and was almost trying to skew us towards, well, what's wrong with Jimmy? And I think that's the question that Kyle Shanahan had, whereas Jimmy Garoppolo is just like any other football player trying to do its best for himself. He comes back, does the 49ers a favor in many ways, because it sounds like the Niners had trade offers on the table for him, but they just weren't good enough to give him up. So they didn't want to ship him out of town. He stays, they rework his deal. He's not picking up the $20 million. He's making closer to probably 10 or 12, so he has to take a pay cut, and he has to sit behind Trey Lance. And then he comes back, and after a 3-5 start, helps you get to the playoffs. So at that point, Jimmy Garoppolo is probably feeling not only on top of the world, but like, I have done you guys a service, and I've taken a discount in many ways to help you do that. Then he gets hurt. Brock Purdy comes in, and at the end of the season, Kyle Shanahan just basically wipes his hand clean and says, you know, there's no scenario. I don't see any scenario in which Jimmy G is going to be back next year. And if you're Jimmy, you're probably saying, well, what the hell, man? Like, yes, I don't expect to be back either.
Right.
But I just did you a favor this entire year, and I helped you get back to a place that if any other quarterback was the backup, well, I guess Brock Purdy might have been able to do something. But in hindsight, Jimmy Garoppolo's like, I helped you out, man. Like, I was the one who extended the olive branch, and you guys are not only kicking me to the curb, but like you're not even going to thank me on the way out?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And we had talked about this a week or two ago, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it's just Shanahan and his great coach, clearly a great play caller, knows football. But I'll just tell the listeners how stuff comes through my head, and then this is why I kind of want to talk about it. So I'm watching the Giants last night, and you know they get beat by the Angels, and then obviously Bruce Bochy's coming back this weekend as the manager of the Texas Rangers. 3-game series starts Friday. Bruce Bochy, 3-time World Series champion, and so I'm thinking, you know what? We got to talk about Bochy at some point and what made him a great manager. And we just started batting some stuff back and forth. And the one thing that's obvious about Bruce Bochy, right, I think we can all agree, is that he is elite. Bruce Bochy, as a manager, as a leader, is elite at the relationship game. Would you give me that, first of all? Or that he's very good at it. Managing relationships, lines of communication open, great perspective as a former player. I don't know that I'd go all the way and say player's manager because he could make tough decisions, but you knew where they were coming from. My point is I think we can all agree that Bruce Bochy was pretty darn good when it came to relationship/communication.
I'm with you.
Okay. So then I start thinking about all the other coaches we've had. About Steve Kerr.
I think that's where he thrives.
Steve Kerr, great coach. Bruce Bochy, great manager. Kyle Shanahan, great coach. I get it, those other two are champions, but that's not the discussion I want to have right now. How about Gabe Kapler? How's Gabe Kapler in the relationship game?
I think he probably doesn't get enough credit for it just because of what people associate with the Giants, which is, a computer behind or in front of Farhan Zaidi, and he's the one that prints out the lineups and all that stuff. But I think Gabe Kapler, I would identify him as a player's manager. To me, I think guys like playing for him, and he does his best to, I think, bolster and strengthen those relationships.
Where would you rate Kyle Shanahan?
And he's far more of a technician than Gabe Kapler is, in my opinion. And this is where I think it does get hard because in football, you do have to be at some point ruthless. You do have to operate with a kind of usability of your players. You have to look at them like pieces. But I do think that Kyle Shanahan, at least from what I can tell and have seen over the last few years with the 49ers, it does appear like he does that maybe more so than other great coaches. If we're going to put him in that category of a great coach,
okay,
because he's been a 3 out of the last 4 NFC championships, other guys in that class, in that arena,
yes,
I think do a better job with relationships.
So you'd say it's maybe one of the weaker aspects of his overall coaching resume.
Yes.
I don't think that's completely unfair. Then if you take the conversation further, the question becomes, how much does it matter, if any? Can a great schemer and a great technician overcome all that? Or do you not really adhere to the premise in the first place? I'll say this. I do think it's more difficult for a head football coach with 53 guys under him to kind of develop relationships on a level that a basketball or baseball coach can. By the same token, you look at a guy like Andy Reid and maybe a guy like Kyle Shanahan, who is a head coach. You can't do it with all 53. You can't have a great relationship with all 53, but what you do, I think, in football is target, 6-9 guys who are your leaders. Those are the players you have open communication with, and you hope they can send the message to the team, what you're trying to do. I was thinking about it this way. When we talk about the great coaches and managers, so we got Kapler, we got Shanahan, we got Kerr, Tom Sula, Kelly. We'll kind of put those guys aside because they weren't long-term. Harbaugh.
Yeah.
And then I thought of Mark Jackson. And I think that if we're talking about people skills and relationships as a part of coaching, I would put Shanahan and Mark Jackson at the bottom of the list in terms of those coaches and that part of their resume. For example, I kind of said this jokingly. Kyle Shanahan kind of wishes he could talk about a quarterback like Jim Harbaugh talked about his quarterback. You know what I mean? Just the way that Jim Harbaugh supported whoever was under center for him, maybe even went overboard, Evan. But when Alex Smith was a quarterback, Alex Smith was the greatest thing. The minute he went to Kaepernick, Alex Smith was still great. Harbaugh talking. But Kaepernick, he was all in on, and he supported the hell out of him, and that's, to me, a positive of a Jim Harbaugh, of Jim Harbaugh as a coach. So anyway, I'm just throwing this out. Where does Shanahan rank, or his people skills, his relationships, and how much does it matter?
Well, I think Harbaugh had great coach to player skills. I don't know if he always had great people skills, because
great distinction.
A lot of people look at him like a jackass. Now, he's a great coach,
right,
but he's really hard to deal with. Didn't get along with ownership. Cultivated this us against the world mentality that I think if you're a player in the moment seems great, but also by adopting some of that Harbaugh-ness, I think a lot of players also became sometimes unlikable. Like Kaepernick was very difficult, at least from what I've heard of people that covered the team at the time, was kind of difficult sometimes to talk to, and wasn't always like he wasn't Jimmy Garoppolo. Like he wasn't the guy that stands at the podium and answers every question professionally and is just going to give you something, even if it's a throwaway quote. Like Jimmy Garoppolo, and this is where the story kind of stems from with his conversation with Mike Silver, is that even now Jimmy Garoppolo is kind of vague about what happened with the 49ers, but he's giving you a hint at things weren't as they seem. And as it applies to Kyle Shanahan, I do think Kyle Shanahan has better just day-to-day social skills. But the question is, as a head coach, as a leader of men, does he have the communicative abilities to, I don't know, just like fire guys up and get the best out of them? I don't know if that's in him. And I do wonder if that is because his ability as a play caller kind of overshadows that. Like we identify him as I don't know about an offensive genius or guru, but he's very smart. And he's one of the reasons why offenses are run the way they are in the NFL throughout the league. So that kind of overshadows his ability to connect with players because he's so good at that. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's unfair to say he struggles in that department, because if you're looking at the shortcomings of his team, well, it's one thing here, one thing there, one thing there. Right. And so in a way, it does matter. Like the fact that you are deficient in that area as a head coach might be the reason why they haven't gotten over the top.
Well, you said it, and that's what I was kind of getting to, because I'll just throw out my overview in terms of how important this thing is, because I do think it's important. Mark Jackson, to my way of thinking, Mark Jackson would have never, ever won an NBA title as a coach of the Golden State Warriors had he stayed here. And the reason I think he would never have been able to win a title was because of how divisive he was, and how, I'm not even going to talk about X's and O's, although that was a part of it. But for this conversation, I want to talk about relationships, because whatever Mark Jackson was and did as a coach, he alienated too large of a percentage of the team that he coached for them to ever get total buy-in. He had buy-in from Curry and Clay, but he didn't have buy-in from other players, and they were never going to get over the hump that way. Steve Kerr, obviously, to me, he's a relationship guy, and he got the benefit of Steph getting older, and he won titles. And I think we can all agree that Kerr's a communicator. That's one of the things that we think he's really good at. Wasn't the only reason why the Warriors won it, but it was a reason the Warriors won it, because of their chemistry and their style and playing with joy and all that kind of stuff. I'm not suggesting it in any way that Kyle Shanahan, this is going to hold him back, but maybe it is holding him back a little, and maybe it'll be something 4 or 5 years from now we look at and say, man, he just doesn't have the greatest relationship or communication skills that some of the other coaches and managers we've seen around here have. Like, you asked the question, Evan. You said, Steiny, how many guys in that 49er locker room do you think totally have Kyle Shanahan's back? And I thought it was an interesting question. And whenever I hear a question like that, I always go player by player by player, almost. You know what I mean? So we can start to answer that. But I think it's a good question, and it's important.
And look, like with Mark Jackson, and like we're talking about, so Steve Kerr came in, and the team was loaded. I mean, there's just an incredible amount of talent. Even back then, before we knew what these guys were going to be, it was clear that the Warriors had a chance to do something special.
Yep.
The 49ers are in a situation, to me, where they also have a ton, if not the most talent in football. Now, maybe 1 through 53, they're not as deep as other groups, but they're just as top-heavy as anybody outside of probably the quarterback position. So Steve Kerr, I think, does a great job, if not better than any, at kind of unlocking the supreme talent. And Mark Jackson, he didn't get the chance, but he couldn't do that. And that's why I think the Warriors are always going to run into something and a little bit of a problem, because to your point, in order to win a championship, yes, everything has to go right, but you have to have everyone on the same page. And even if it's one member of the starting five or one member of the top 7 of your rotation in basketball that's not on the same page and that feels a bit alienated, that's going to leak over to everyone else. And I think Steve Kerr understands that as good as I've seen a head coach in the NBA. Kyle Shanahan, and I don't know if it's because he's young, and he's also had success. Like, I know he hasn't won a Super Bowl, but he was one of the youngest offensive coordinators in NFL history. Like, he was in the same coaching tree as the McVays, the LaFleurs. He's responsible for Mike McDaniel, Robert Saleh now in New York. Like, he does have guys under him that he can point to and say, I made that dude, or I helped that guy in his career get to now where people are respecting him. So I should be, like, I'm responsible for that. He's got that kind of cachet. He just doesn't have the chip.
Right.
But in order to get that championship, everyone 1 through 53 has to be in lockstep, and I just do not know. And if people feel the same way, because I've seen people chiming in on the text line from the 510, Kyle's arrogant, Kyle's over the top, he doesn't have people skills. I don't know if those things are 100% true, but it doesn't feel like, to me, every single person on the Niners team feels like they want to go to war for Kyle Shanahan. And I think that is something that's required for a football team that has Super Bowl aspirations.